Welcome to the second in our series of lunchtime lectures on magical art with former History of Art teacher, Robert Orme. As many of you know, our virtually speaking programme of online talks began over summer, and they proved so popular that we decided to continue with the programme this term. Robert's brilliant series of talks on modern art formed part of the summer virtually speaking programme. And of course, we jumped at the chance to invite Robert back for a new series of talks this term on an equally enthralling subject, magical art. Robert, who taught at Latimer for nearly 50 years and continues to give art history tours and talks to the school community to this day, will this afternoon be speaking on the changing beliefs about witchcraft expressed in art. The breadth and depth of Robert's knowledge never fails to astound, and I'm sure today will be no exception. If you've joined us before, you will know that these talks hope to raise money for the bursary in Robert's name, helping to widen access to art history for state school pupils in the local area who share his passion and enthusiasm for the subject by providing a dedicated bursary for a gifted student. Thank you for your support. Today we've raised £250 towards the Robert Orme bursary. Moving on to a couple of house rules. Everyone will be placed on mute so that you can all hear the talk clearly. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat facility so that we can review them and so that Robert can answer as many as time allows at the end of his talk. Now, please join me in welcoming Robert Orme for what I'm sure will be a fascinating lecture on magical art, witchcraft in art.
Thank you. The word witchcraft has multiple meanings. If you were an archaeologist, you might call shamans in prehistoric rituals witches. If you're an anthropologist studying the Azande, you claim that they had beliefs in witchcraft. And if you are a journalist, you might report murders in London in the last 10 years as Nigerian witchcraft murders. And if you were an ardent feminist, you might decide to set up your own coven, become a white witch, and therefore proclaim witchcraft as the power of feminism. But we're not going to be talking about any of that. What we're going to look at is the way in which art represented the ideas of witchcraft in the period between roughly about 1500 and 1900 in Europe. So if we go to the screen, you're going to see a Renaissance painting of what actually they believed about witchcraft. Renaissance obviously is to do with going back to the ancient world, and therefore they read about the ideas in ancient literature of how magic could be performed. And this is an image of the witch, so-called Circe, who was in Homer's Odyssey. And if you look on the far right, you can see a little group of men sitting down. And the story in the Odyssey is that Odysseus and his companions were shipwrecked on the island where Circe was queen. And as queen, she had various kind of magical powers which she used against them. And therefore, she's often called a witch in the classical vocabulary. She's sitting with a spell. You can see it in her right hand. She has a magic wand with which she's going to cast the spell. She's safe from the effects of her spell because on the ground you can actually see a magic circle, and in it are various of the signs by which you were supposed to be able to conjure up spirits and devils. And her magic is turned against the Odysseus and his companions. But follow her eyes. Look up at the tree, top left, and there you get three little, what would often be called voodoo dolls, which are actually meant to be the representations of Odysseus and his companions who are sitting on the right. And it is certainly true that there are, from ancient Egypt and from ancient Greece and Rome, right through to Middle Ages and Renaissance in England, there were magicians who did actually make models, do things to them, stick pins in and so on. And the idea was that actually whatever you did to the model happened to the victim as well. But this is a story of metamorphosis, because Circe had these magical powers, and what she's done is to cast her spell on Odysseus and his companions. And if you look at bottom left, do you see that there is a rather friendly looking kind of a dog. There is then a bird, and then there is a breastplate. And if you look across to the figures on the right, one of them is wearing a breastplate. And therefore, this is a painting of what in the Renaissance they believed magical witchcraft was about in the time of the ancient Greeks and Homer. It's painted by an artist from Ferrara, Dosso Dossi, and it therefore shows the sort of learned view of witchcraft as they understood it in Renaissance humanism. But what we're mainly going to look at is going to be what actually were the ways in which witchcraft was represented during the so-called witch craze of the 16th and 17th centuries. If you look at this diagram, you can see trials that were going on between 1300 and 1850. And you've got on the left the countries, and you can see that it's actually Germany and Switzerland that had the most. And then if you look at the graph at the bottom, you can see that there is in fact little about witchcraft before 1500. It's not actually a medieval phenomenon to have trials against witches. Whereas you can see that around about the year 1600, it reaches a peak, and you get lots of trials where the witches were accused. They were tried by royal courts, they were tried by local cities in Germany, they were tried by the Inquisition in Spain, and the result often was going to be that the witches were tortured till they produced confessions. They were often going to be then executed. In Europe, they were often burnt as heretics. In England, they tended to get hung. And then you can see how, after around about the year 1700, there's a dramatic falling off and virtually no trials of witchcraft at all. Therefore, they talk about the European witch craze of the 16th and 17th centuries. And it's become much studied by modern historians because I think it's fascinating to work out why there was this sudden upsurge in these beliefs, these accusations, and these deaths. And the explanations they come up with are mostly going to be socioeconomic and political, and they're going to relate to population growth, creating pressure on some parts of society, economic competition between people in villages who are doing well or doing badly, the growth of towns with wealth and therefore rivalries, periods when there were going to be epidemics of things like the plague, and therefore most modern historians view witchcraft craze as being about actually scapegoating and finding people to blame for the things that were going wrong. And I think you're going to be able to see in these pictures that we're going to look at, I think you're going to be able to see how much the artists represented widespread beliefs about witchcraft, which were going to actually then explain why they went in for persecuting and executing so many witches. Therefore, I believe that in this period, lots of people were really frightened of witchcraft because of their basic Christian beliefs. If you look at Dürer's Night, Death and the Devil, you'll be able to see the implication, you look at the idea that actually there is going to be death stalking human beings. And this death was going to be due to, according to the books of the time, witchcraft. If you go back to Malleus Maleficarum, there was a famous book produced in 1484 by Heinrich Kramer in Germany called The Hammer of Evildoers, which went through many editions like this and was widely read and arguably had a big influence on how witches were treated. He had been trying to persecute witches in his hometown. He got thrown out by the town, and he therefore wrote this book about what were, he believed, the activities of witches, and he was appealing to the Pope. And in this book, it contains all sorts of the ideas that were around about witchcraft, and he succeeded in getting the Pope to actually put out a bull against witchcraft as a kind of heresy, where it encouraged the Inquisition to actually search for witches. And this process of persecution did actually produce lots of arrests. The women were confessing, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes through the use of torture, to a whole series of beliefs. And these beliefs become the stuff of art. The next picture is from a book called The Inconstancy of Bad Evil Angels, and is by a man called Philippe de l'Ancre, who was working in Bordeaux in 1612. In 1609, he'd been involved in various real trials. He then wrote his book, which was compiled by looking at trials from all over Europe and put together the kind of mass mythology of what witchcraft was actually about and what he was believed to be doing in the 16th and 17th centuries. It basically was thought to be an inversion of Christianity, and these witches turning to worship Satan, who you can see on the throne top right. And to worship Satan, they were alleged to form groups called covens, and then come to meetings called Sabbats. And if you look at the cloud of smoke in the center, or if you look at the goat on the right of the cloud, you can see lots of images of witches believed to actually fly to these Sabbath meetings. And then when they get there, you can see what they were supposed to allege to do. Top left, you can see a band of witches, literally a band, because they're actually playing music, aren't they? Next down, they're dancing, but A, they're dancing naked. B, it's a special witches dance, the inversion of norms, because they're literally dancing back to back. Then they're actually forming a choir and singing to the devil. And then when you get to the bottom right, you can see how their Sabbath turned into a kind of feast and a party. And what you've got on the table is the menu. And shockingly, the menu actually contains a small baby that has been cooked and is about to be eaten. And therefore, when you get to the group on the top right, you've got the devil and his assistants on a throne. You've got two witches, and you see how they're actually offering a child, a baby, to the devil as a sacrifice. And the claim was that the witches did all these things, the most abominable things that you could do, blasphemous and cannibalism and infanticide. And what you did was to actually then summon up the devil. And if you look in the middle on the far right, you can see that devils have appeared and the witches are actually dancing with the devil. So you've got this widespread mythology, which most historians would now say is invented and made up by theologians. It's invented by torture, getting answers to the questions where you ask leading questions about what happened, and then the witches confess to what they thought they were meant to say. But it's true that some modern historians have actually discovered evidence of witchcraft existing. There's a group in Italy called I Benedanti, which were discovered as having actually heard of the ideas of witchcraft and then forming a real group that probably did actually do some of the things you can see in this picture. And they certainly believe that there were in local villages wise women who were actually alleged to be witches, who were practicing all sorts of forms of folk magic. And therefore, belief in witchcraft was very widespread at this period. And I'm going to claim that the imagery that you get in art then helps to explain why they took witchcraft so seriously and why they feared witches so much. As I say, the Christian idea was that man's life is a kind of journey through death and the devil. And if you look at the Dürer knight riding through the valley of the shadow of death, he is a good Christian. He's probably meant to be heading to the church that you can see center in the background. But on either side of him, he's got Time's winged chariot flying by. The figure of death is actually carrying, as you can see, an hourglass, so time is slipping by. And as he fights the good Christian fight, you can see on the far right, there is the devil, always with him, always beside him, leading him into sin. And of course, as you know, the wages of sin is death. And Adam and Eve should have lived forever in the Garden of Eden, but when they're thrown out, their punishment is that they receive sickness and illness and death. And therefore, they really did believe that actually a lot of the problems they faced did actually come from the devil. So if you look at the next image, you'll see how they believed that witches could affect the weather. This is a 15th century woodcut from De Lamis in Pethonicis, which shows a little pair of witches doing a magic spell. And look, in the sky, they have magically produced a cloud which is bringing down rain. And if you were living in rural society in the early modern period, your life was totally dependent upon the weather. If the rain did not come, your crops did not grow. If the rain came when you were about to harvest, your crops rotted. And therefore, you were going to be in a situation where you had no real control over your food supply. And one village might be lucky with weather, and another village might get the rainstorm at just the wrong moment, in which case it was very easy to believe that somehow it was women in the other village who'd cast spells and therefore brought disaster to your crop by weather magic. And this belief in weather magic was very widespread. It was believed by King James I of England. And if you look at this picture here, this is from events of the year 1509, when James, as King of Scotland, was due to marry Anne of Denmark, but her ships got sunk on the way, and the belief was that it was caused, the storms, by witches. And in Denmark, there was a trial of a witch called Anna, who was supposed to have created the storms. In Scotland, James had various women arrested and had one, Agnes, executed for having caused the storms that killed some of the nobles in the ships that were bringing his new bride. And therefore, on the right, you can see the witch at work doing a kind of sympathetic magic, which was supposed to be able to create a storm. Because what she's got, as you can see, is a sieve. And if she pours water through the sieve, lo and behold, clouds appear in the sky, rain falls, the winds roar, and therefore witches could literally kill you by creating storms at sea. But obviously the main forms of death were known to be illness, and illness was often viewed as a consequence of the devil and witchcraft. One of the most wonderful paintings from Germany in the 16th century is this, the Isenheim altar by Grunervald, dating from 1516. And it's a polyptych. It's got all these panels that fold, and at different times you see different things. And this was painted for a monastery of St. Anthony in Isenheim, which was specializing in hospital work. And this was actually placed in the ward of their hospital. And the patients were in their beds suffering from various illnesses. And they could look towards this and they could see how the suffering Christ was going to actually help them, because he's a remarkable figure hanging properly from the cross, and his body is distorted, contorted, hunger, and then it's covered with blotches and marks, because this hospital specialized in skin diseases, and it specialized in things like the plague, where you were going to get buboes on your body. And therefore, the hospital was having this picture apparently as an image of hope, where you prayed to Jesus and maybe your illness would be got rid of. But they could shut the doors, and when they did that, you get this horrific image of St. Anthony, the patron saint of their hospital. St. Anthony was an Egyptian monk in the 4th century. He retreated from the sinful world to the desert, but this is the temptation of St. Anthony, where, as you can see, all the devils come to him and they drag him by his hair, and monstrous devils like these appear to him and try to tempt him before dragging him off, they hope, to hell. And of course, the way that they tempted him was by showing him all the visions of the different sins that he could commit. And famously, he was a monk, so he'd taken vows of chastity, and therefore the devil summoned up spirits of naked women who would appear to St. Anthony to try and get him to give up his vows of chastity. And he didn't. The devils never do take him off to hell, and therefore he becomes a patron saint of diseases like St. Anthony's fire, but also of an epidemic that was sweeping Germany in the early 16th century. This hospital in Isenheim was faced with one of the problems of the Italian wars, where soldiers returning from Italy brought with them a new plague. The new plague was syphilis. And therefore, this picture is particularly relevant to their hospital, where you got syphilis and you believed that it was due to the power of the devil. And if you look bottom left, the figure there might be a representation of one of these bloated ill, sick people, dying from the plague or dying from syphilis. And therefore, the way that you die is due to the devil and sin. So illnesses were thought to be given to you by the devil, and they often struck you down like an arrow. If you look at the center top, you can just see a little devil there, and you see he's just holding out a spear or a dagger. And this then links to witchcraft, because in the next picture, you've got this little woodcut, which shows probably a witch actually causing illness in her victim. You can tell that it's meant to be a witch, because if you look, the bow is being fired backwards, and witchcraft was supposed to be the inversion of the Christian religion. And therefore, what she's doing is to actually cause illness. So if you were living in the 16th century and you suddenly fell ill, you often were likely to not know any real cause of what was going on, and therefore you might well think that you've actually been bewitched and blame a witch for causing this. And sometimes witches are supposed to be able to harm you by ritual, by doing things like shooting bows backwards, but they also had a power of what was called fascination. And this picture here is a Tractatus de Fascinatione by Johann Frohman, published in Germany in 1684, and it shows something that you probably have heard of, which is actually the evil eye that fascinates you. And the belief was that when you became a witch, you were going to actually be possessed by the devil. The devil is inside you, and they had the wrong theory about how eyesight actually worked. They believed in what is called extromission, where eye beams are literally things that come out from your eye, rays that come out, touch an object, bounce back, and show you what you're actually seeing. And therefore, if you are a witch and you've got evil inside you, evil rays as eye beams come out of you can harm your victim. And if you look at the center of the bottom, you see rays are coming down and killing cattle, and therefore evil eye can cause cattle and your livelihood to go. And then in the middle rank and center on the right, you can see the worst belief they had, where you can see that a witch is looking towards a woman holding a baby. She's pointing at it, she's staring at it, but her eye beams are actually aimed, as you can see, precisely at the baby's head. Because as when we were doing astrology last week, they knew that there is a hole in the top of the head of the baby. Its bones and its flesh are soft, and therefore they believe that things like evil eyes, the rays from them, were particularly liable to harm and kill babies. And as you know, the death rate for infants was incredibly high in this early modern period, and therefore you really would be frightened of the evil eye. And they sometimes literally put lead shields over babies in order to actually stop the rays getting through. They put jewels on babies so that when the rays hit the baby, the jewels would actually deflect the rays so that the baby would not be harmed. But the best thing to do was going to be to pray to God for help. And if you were going to pray to the saints as a Catholic, the saint you prayed to was St. Lucy. And St. Lucy, in this painting by Cossa, is shown with the way in which she was martyred. A 15th century legend said that she was a martyr who had been killed by having her eyes gouged out. Therefore, she holds the martyr's palm, and as you can see in her hand, she's got this flower, which actually are her eyes. And therefore, the implication was that St. Lucy became the patron saint of eyes and eyesight. And if you came on one of our trips to Venice, you may remember going to the church and actually seeing what was said to be the relics of St. Lucy, which were supposed to miraculously cure problems with the eye. Therefore, you should wear one of these. This is a modern version of a little glass eye, but this is a widespread belief. It existed in the 16th century. It was widespread in Italian folklore. It exists still in Turkey today, and you can still buy these little glass eyes, and you hope that they're going to be the good eyes of St. Lucy. And if you wear one of these, there's a battle of the eye beams, and the good beams from St. Lucy should be able to counteract the evil beams from the devil. Therefore, they took witchcraft very seriously because it actually was a way of explaining the shortness of their lives, either through the weather or through disease. But another way in which witchcraft was supposed to, another reason why witchcraft was going to have been widely believed in, is between its links between witchcraft and psychology. And if you look at this next picture of the devil, this is a image of what they believe the devil was like. And in the 16th century, a lot of mental illness was going to actually be accused of being witchcraft. In 1584, an Englishman, Reginald Scott, wrote a book called The Discovery of Witchcraft, in which he said he was discovering how it wasn't true. And he said that witchcraft was actually often, people accused of being witches were often actually suffering from what we would call mental illness and what he called melancholy, as we were discussing last week. And this melancholy, he said, caused people to have all sorts of delusions where they might think they were kings and queens. They might think that they were urinals and being pissed upon, and therefore have these delusions, which we would now call schizophrenic. And if you were bipolar or schizophrenic in this period, your behavior seemed strange, and therefore you were going to be accused of a witch, being a witch. And under torture, you might well describe your visions, and you might well actually believe these were genuine visions that you'd actually seen. And therefore, these kind of images of the devil may well be based on the kind of delusions, nightmares that people suffered from in schizophrenia. Plus also, it's possible that some of the witches' rituals may have actually given them other delusions. What you've got in this next picture is a scene from the 17th century where there's a group of witches, they're working together, they've got little devils helping them, bottom right, and then you can see what their belief in flying to the Sabbath. There's a chimney piece, there's a woman on a broomstick who is going up the chimney, flying off to the Sabbath. But you get ready to go to the Sabbath by applying what was called a flying ointment. And you can see the woman leaning on the right of the chimney, rubbing it into the skin of the naked woman who is about to fly up the chimney. And quite a lot of recipes for these flying ointments have actually survived, and they're basically herbal. And the herbs that they used, things like belladonna, were going to actually be very closely linked to hallucinogenic drugs like LSD today. And you still talk about how LSD gives you a high. There are legends, aren't there, of actually people on LSD stepping out of windows because they were believing that they could fly. And therefore, it's quite possible that if you did actually make these kind of recipes, this would have made you delusional, and therefore you would have had genuinely visions of devils, witches, sabbats, and so on. So these may well represent people's psychology in the 16th century. And you can see that in the kind of devils that they actually painted in art. If we look more closely here, you can see the devil that appears in the Grunervald St. Anthony. And that is very similar to the kind of drawings that you would get from patients in mental hospitals who are paranoid, who believe that devils and spirits are out to get them, and therefore they create these mishmash figures where they take all these composite bits and put them together and create these really horrific images, which are the stuff of nightmares. And the devil was never supposed to be able to make a perfect body. He tried to appear on earth, but he couldn't do what God did and create perfect human beings. And therefore, you recognize that a devil is a devil because he has human characteristics, but they're always mixed up with other things. You can see in here the way in which the Dura devil is partly an animal, partly almost like a pig, but then he's also got goat-like features of horns, looks like one horn as it makes him a unicorn. And this kind of monstrous image is a creation of the artist's imagination, but these are mostly artists working in Germany, where the witch craze had its peak and where popular ideas of what the devil was like are quite likely to have influenced what the artists painted. And this painting by Michael Pacher dates from about 1470, and it shows a saint called Saint Wolfgang, who is exorcising a devil. You've got on the left the saint. You've got a town which is deserted with people looking anxiously through their windows because this devil is trying to take over the town and take over its church. But you can be exorcised. And St. Wolfgang is using bell, book and candle sort of thing. And he's actually got the devil now to serve him. And the devil is, as you can see, holding the Bible. And St. Wolfgang can simply read the words of God, make the sign of the cross, and now the devil is under his power. But this devil is, again, a really composite kind of devil. He's got all sorts of characteristics of a monster. If you go back 2 images to the one of the first image of the devil you looked at, this picture here shows you one of the characteristics of the devil. He has got, as you can see, 2 faces, and the second face is over his stomach, with the belly button being the mouth. And literally this fits in with the notion that the devil is always a liar, will always trick you, because he is literally 2-faced. Whereas if you go forward to the Packer and you look at the exorcism, you can see here that in the exorcism you've got a devil, and he has got faces, but the devil was actually believed to have a 3rd face. And you can see that the 3rd face is on his arse, and therefore he talks crap, doesn't he? And therefore they had these very powerful images of what devils were like in the paintings that were produced in particularly Reformation Germany. So the beliefs in witchcraft led to these kind of images. You also have the situation where they were going to start to actually have beliefs about more than just what the devil was like. There were various artists who did paintings which perhaps showed what Sabbaths and magic was about. The magic was often going to be linked into sexuality. And this is a painting from Flanders in the 15th century. And what it does is to show you a witch practicing what they believed was love magic. And you can see that she's like a naked Venus. You can see that she's got spell books on her right. And there is plenty of evidence that people did, in fact, actually go to magicians and women to look for love magic, potions and so on, that could make someone that you fancied fall in love with you. But of course, in the teachings of religion in the 16th century, this is definitely going to be the sin of lust. And therefore, people who made love potions were going to be regarded actually as instruments of the devil creating sin. And therefore, in 16th century psychology, witchcraft and sexuality got very closely interlinked. And you can see that in the way that they represented what went on in the Sabbaths. So if you go to the Sabbath picture next, you'll see how they actually had this idea of Sabbaths being organized in ways that were going to create sinful people. So you've got, therefore, the way in which you've got the devil creating people's beliefs and leading them to all these strange kinds of forms of behavior. And this led them to, therefore, have this kind of fear of sex. You can see how they actually specialized in doing these pictures of naked women at Sabbats. And the witch's magic wasn't only going to be in favor of actually helping you to have sex and love potions, they also believed in the power of witches to actually harm your sex life. Witches were believed to actually make you impotent. They were believed to be able to actually make you have problems in a marriage whereby you might not be able to consummate it. One of the ways was to create what were called ligatures, where they literally tied knots. And just as marriage still is talking about getting knotted, in those days, a witch's knot meant that you actually wouldn't be able to consummate the marriage. And in the Malleus Maleficarum, there is a really strange and famous section where witches are believed to be able to make men impotent because they can actually steal men's penises. And the text says that they stole their penises and then hung them on a tree. And you've got these 2 pictures from the Middle Ages of manuscripts which show phallus trees. And you've got what might be witches who are supposed to have stolen your potency, stolen your penis and therefore put them on a tree and prevented you from actually consummating your marriage. And in the Middle Age, in the 16th century, this was very important, not only for noble families, but also for all families, that they needed to produce children in order to be able to survive. Now, these pictures are not necessarily of witches, because they're from medieval manuscripts, and they may actually simply be jokes, because there are fabulous stories which were about actually women playing tricks on men and stealing their penises and putting them on trees. But this was then turned by Kramer, who wrote the Malleus Maleficarum, into a belief in actually the power of witches to make men impotent. And therefore, if you were impotent, you turned to magic maybe as the cure. Because in this next picture by Lotto, which is of Venus, painted for a marriage ceremony in the early 16th century, now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, you can see Venus, who is obviously a suitable picture to have in your bedroom as a goddess of marriage. And you've got a little Cupid on the left, as you can see. But the strangeness in this picture is, if you look, little Cupid is actually pissing on her. And then she is holding, as you can see, a wreath, a ring. And there are various magical texts which say that if you want to get rid of a curse that is making you impotent, you should reenact what is going on, whereby you literally piss through a ring. And then when the marriage happens, you'll be able to put your finger through the marriage ring in the real ceremony, and then you should be able to consummate it afterwards. Therefore, the beliefs in witchcraft were deeply embedded in people's ideas of sex and fears of sex because of their Christian religion. But the most straightforward and obvious thing about the witch craze was who were going to actually be executed. Almost all the witch trials were of women. Most of the victims of the witch craze were going to be women. There are men, like Dr. Faustus, who are alleged to have made pacts with the devil, but almost all the pictures show women, and these are Dürer's witches. And Dürer had a pupil called Hans Baldung Green, and Hans Baldung Green did a whole series of images which show what actually women were believed to be getting up to when they went to Sabbaths. This is what is called a chiaroscuro wood print. It's a woodcut which was printed in various different colours, and then could also be hand coloured like this version. And what you've got here is those typical beliefs that we saw in De l'Ancre of the witches. You can see the witches are making potions. You can see in the sky that they use the potion and carry it to fly on a goat, which is probably meant to be the devil, that brings them to the Sabbath. And then all sorts of things happen at the Sabbath. This is a print, but the next Baldung Green is a drawing where you can see these three witches. And again, what you can see is an image of the witches where they are actually doing some kind of magical rite where they're making things, they're holding up a platter, perhaps with a skull on it. They've got this ring of beads, and therefore this is them practicing witchcraft. But they're very much in the Dürer style of actually fat, buxom women, prominently showing buttocks, prominently showing breasts. And therefore, this is about the way in which you thought that women were the witches, and women got together in these Sabbaths. And then women were going to be heavily sexualized by such a patriarchal and misogynist society. Therefore, you believe that this is what women got up to. And this strange drawing, which is also by Hans Baldung Green, is an image which shows the witches naked. And then if you look at what is going on, it looks as though it's women masturbating, women who are lesbians. And this is a series of pictures that Hans Baldung Green produced in Germany in the early 16th century in Strasbourg. And there's a debate among historians about how to interpret them. There were witch trials in Strasbourg at this period, and they may be based on actual stories of women who claim that they'd been to Sabbaths, and this is what the witches got up to. But there are also people who think that these might be joke pictures, semi-pornographic pictures, which are produced in order to actually show the way in which more learned humanists mocked and thought that the popular beliefs about witchcraft were just jokes. But either way, it shows you these strange pictures which are so misogynistic and have this strange view of actually how women are going to relate to each other, and how witchcraft is actually to do with the fear of women and the fear of sexuality. And you can see this fear of sexuality and witchcraft in this strange print by Parmigianino. He was an Italian artist of the early 16th century working in Parma, and this print is said to be by him. And you've got what is presumably a witch, and witches are linked into these goats, and they're linked into screech owls and things. But this witch rides to the Sabbath apparently on a phallus. And this is a very patriarchal image of the fear of women in the 16th century. The missionary position was supposed to be best according to actually church teachings in theology. Medically, it was supposed to give you your best chance of being able to produce a baby. And the image of woman on top was almost literally heretical. And therefore, what you've got here is image of the fear that men in the 16th century had of how women might actually dominate them, and how feminine sexuality was a threat to their masculinity. And these beliefs were very widespread, and they linked devil, witchcraft, and sexuality very closely together, because there were whole books written by theologians and doctors on what were called incubi and succubi. And these are devils who can actually take on a form which enables them to come to earth and have sex with people. They are believed to take on illusory forms. They're often supposed to come to you in the night in your dreams, so you're just having presumably some sort of sexual fantasy dream in the Freudian sense, but they were believed to be actually real, and you were supposed to be able to actually encounter, if you're a witch, the devil. And in witch trials, the witches, under torture probably, gave very graphic descriptions of what the devil was like, what his sexuality was like, how he was both male and female at the same time, how his penis could be like a red-hot poker, or it could be a frozen icicle. And therefore, there are vivid descriptions of women who had sex with the devil. And again, in Hans Baldwin Green, you can actually see this happening. Because if you look at this picture here, this is a picture by Hans Baldwin Green, which shows a kind of devil dragon, who, as you can see, is encountering a woman who is deliberately shown with very prominent buttocks. And if we go into close-up on the image, you can see exactly what the devil is up to. There is the devil. He is literally tonguing the woman. And in the 16th century, they had a hierarchy of things to do with lust. And adultery is bad. Incest is worse. And then when you get to the area of sodomy, then you are going to actually have the things that are most considered linked to the devil and to heresy. And therefore, this is the kind of sex that this devil, dragon, by Hans Baldwin Green, apparently wants. And then in Switzerland, there was another artist called Urs Graf, who did some extraordinary drawings in the early 16th century. He did a drawing which shows a priest and a devil. And this priest and devil are walking along. You can see his signature bottom left, Urs Graf, and the date 1512. And then when you look at the devil, you can see the face of the devil is pretty recognizably like the Dura devil that we looked at earlier. And then if you look, you can see how he's got an enormous tail between his legs. And that is obviously very phallic, isn't it? And he is definitely tapping the priest on the shoulder and trying to lure him, like St. Anthony, into giving up his chastity and turning to sex. And then you get this strange image also by Urs Graf, which shows a devil and a soldier. The soldier is a soldier of a type that came back from the Italian wars. The devil is again rather like the Dürer devil that we looked at. His most prominent feature are his bollocks, which hang down, and you can see that the codpiece on the soldier is almost like an erection, and the position of the devil doesn't give much doubt as to what the devil is doing. And therefore, you've got this notion that witchcraft and the devil associated with all the forms of sexuality that are most likely to be most forbidden in the 16th and 17th century, according to their religious beliefs. So I think we've seen that in some 16th century and 17th century art, you've got the reasons why people so feared and worried about witchcraft. It might literally kill them by the weather. It might kill them by disease. It represented their darkest fantasies when they were suffering from mental illnesses. It showed their fear of women and their fear of sexuality. And therefore, the artists show what may well have been the actual beliefs of the society about witchcraft, which helped to explain why there was a witch craze in that period. But as we saw in the original diagram, after about 1700, you get a decline in belief in witchcraft. You get the 18th century rationalists and scientists claiming that most of the things that had been explained by witchcraft could be explained by science. So you get developments in medicine, you get developments in meteorology, and therefore you get a decline, arguably, in belief in witchcraft, and you begin to call it magic and superstition. You also, therefore, get a decline in witch trials and executions, and therefore, in the 18th century, you get a vast switch from the witch craze to a period of disbelief. And at the end of the 18th century, you get new kind of pictures of witchcraft created by Goya in Spain. Now that's a Goya Lithograph print, and it shows you those beliefs we've just been talking about. There are two witches flying on a kind of broomstick with the help of a devil in the sky, taking them to a Sabbath. But look at the witch there, and whereas green was emphasizing their attractiveness and their sexuality, Goya, in my opinion, is kind of mocking her as an old superstitious hag who has talked about these beliefs about flying, and he, as a rationalist, would probably not believe in witchcraft. And if you look at the Goya painting of a Sabbath, which is in the Prado, you've got here those traditional beliefs that we saw in the de l'Ancre print. This is a coven of witches. You can see that they're holding up a baby and they're offering it to the devil who has appeared and who is sort of goat-like and so on, as in the tradition. But is he really a terrifying devil? Isn't a sort of mixture of goat and donkey? And doesn't he actually look ridiculous? And then if you look at the people who are at the Sabbath, they're going to be old women and hags. And therefore, probably, Goya was not himself believing in witchcraft, which was still a folk belief in Spain in the late 18th century. And he probably accepted the thing that the rationalists put forward, that the belief in witchcraft was a delusion created by the Catholic religion itself. And famously, he did paintings of the Inquisition. And when you look at this, you're seeing the kind of Inquisition that he set up, that he painted, and you can see that the inquisitors sit and they have their victims brought before them, put in special clothes, and the Inquisition was allowed to use torture. And the 18th century argument was that the tortures allowed by the Inquisition, encouraged by the Pope, had actually produced confessions where all these delusional things happened according to descriptions of Sabbaths, of meetings with the devil. And these were simply delusions that had been created by the irrational Roman Catholic Church that he was against. And therefore, I think that these are mockery and satire of witchcraft rather than the belief in it. But whereas the previous Sabbath that he painted was, in my opinion, a satire on witchcraft, at the end of his life, he had problems where he was losing court patronage. He'd witnessed terrible things during the French invasions in the Peninsular War, And he retreated to a private house on the edges of Madrid, and he produced his so-called dark paintings, which are now housed in one room in the Prado. And when you go there, you'll see they really are dark in terms of colour, and they have very dark subject matter in terms of death and violence and so on. And therefore, it's quite possible that when he does this Sabbath with a goat and so on, this is no longer the satirical, rational, jokey kind of painting. This looks to me like a much more romantic painting where the artist actually is expressing his own feelings, basically of depression that he had at the end of his life, and which caused him to paint these dark and sinister pictures. Therefore, Romanticism was going to actually use witchcraft in all sorts of different ways, just as, for example, Goethe was using it in his Faust, produced at roughly the same time as this painting. And by the end of the 19th century, you get a complete reversal of attitudes towards witchcraft and the devil. You get to the end of the 19th century, and as we were discussing when we were looking at Beardsley in the 1890s, you get to a movement that is called the decadence. And whereas earlier in the century, decadence had been condemned by Gibbon as causing the decline of the Roman Empire, by the end of the 19th century, if you wanted to revolt against 19th century Catholic and Victorian prudery, you then deliberately adopted the opposite. And there was a movement of writers and painters called the decadents. And these people produced books where, to overthrow and rebel against the conventions of the 19th century morality, they actually praised and adopted those things that were considered bad. There's a whole series of novels like those of J.K. Huysmans in France, where they actually wrote about the way in which the other things in the world were going to be better than the bourgeois conventional moral norms. And Huysmans wrote a novel called Là-bas, and other novels where he actually went into the kind of undergrowth of literature and art and life that were around in the 1890s. And he famously created a character, Des Esseintes, who was a symbolist and tried all sorts of symbols and sensual pleasures, but who also visited the occult and was associated with a genuine, real Abbé Boulon, who was around in Paris in the 1890s and who was alleged and tried for actually worshipping the devil. And you can also see that in the work of Félicien Rops. This is a modern book called Lust for the Devil, which gives you reproductions of lots of his works. And Rops was famously an underground artist who worked for symbolists and decadents and produced images which were often basically semi-pornographic and which contained the ideas of the decadents. And if you look at this witch here, she has this giant manuscript of witchcraft grimoire, but then if you look at the way it's painted, it's actually really a very prurient kind of image, because what he's really interested in is her buttocks. And then you've got what was conceived in the late 19th century as a very obvious phallic broomstick upon which she is going to ride. And therefore, you've got him becoming very interested in the ideas of Satanism and the occult. And this sexualized image of the witch was going to be something that made his prints very popular. The next picture is his image of sacrifice. And as you can see at the top, you do actually have a devil. And then below, descending like a snake towards the altar on which there is a nude woman, the devil is coming down. And this is actually the image that was produced of a kind of devil incubus coming to have sex with the woman who is lying on the altar. And the books that were written in the 17th century about incubi and succubi were actually published in Paris in translation into French by the publisher Isidore Lisieux, and therefore were popular bestsellers with this very eroticized description of how actually witches worship the devil and had sex with the devil being put into their kind of symbolist art. And Rops also produced an image of a black mass. You have a woman who is on the altar, you have men who are watching her, because this again is very sexist kind of image. And then blasphemously, you actually have a nude woman who is being crucified as well. And therefore, by the end of the 19th century, people who believed in the occult could actually adopt and take up witchcraft and Satanism as something that gave them a real frisson that they were actually engaged in, because it helped them to revolt against the traditions of morality. So I would argue that you have moved from, in the 16th, 17th century, imagery of witches, which may well have represented real beliefs and fears about witchcraft, to, in the 19th century, the Romantics, who use the ideas of traditional magic for their own purposes. So next week, what I'm going to be doing is to look at Romantic visionaries. And then the week after that, we go into the 20th century. And in the 20th century, you get a whole series of writers and artists who take the left-hand path and therefore pursue really dark sides of magic, like in the work of Aleister Crowley, Eric Gill, and Austin Osman Sphere. But that is all still to come. So I'd be interested to hear any questions or reactions to these images of witchcraft that you've seen today.
Brilliant. Thank you, Robert. That was absolutely fascinating, as always. I can see we've got a couple of questions. We've got 3 questions in the chat. Robert, do you want to unmute yourself and ask you a couple of questions?
Yes, hello there. The first question, which is quite interesting, is why was Kramer driven out of his town originally? What had he done
because,
to make him persona non grata?
Because this is before the witch craze. In other words, the belief in witchcraft existed in the Middle Ages, but it was not on an organized basis. And you'd had lots of heresies and trials for heresy, but in this German town, there must have been citizens there who believed in the judicial process of their town court, or who didn't believe in these superstitions about individual witches. And therefore, when people were trying to set up witch trials, loads happened, but they did also face opposition. And that is what was encouraging Kramer to then write his Hammer of Witchcraft.
His opposition to allow the process to be much more acceptable, you mean? The process of
there were going to be lawyers and theologians who would not have believed in witchcraft in the way that he did, and thought that what he was doing was going to be starting some sort of panic and persecution.
So why would they push him out, though? Because they were simply opposed
because he was creating trouble. He was arresting, having women arrested and tried, and they didn't think this was judicially right, and therefore they got rid of him. And there are also some stories that say that there were also allegations against him and his sex life, but I don't know if that's true.
Okay, fair enough. And the second question I have as a follow-up is, you're saying that these ideas were present in nascent form in the Middle Ages, but how were they kind of formulated and diffused in the Renaissance so they became a prevalent European perception of this?
Modern historians would mostly argue, in my opinion, that they think of the 16th century as a period of rapid social change. You've got the growth of population, you've got economic development, and in a society like that, you're going to have tensions between people and groups of people. And therefore, most of the books that have been written since the 60s on witchcraft and the witch craze have emphasized the socioeconomic causes of it. And that then encouraged you to take up ideas that had been around and then put them together, like in the Malleus Maleficarum.
Right, but that means they're being transmitted through the written word and diffused through a literate population, or maybe preached.
Also by the organization of the church. The church did actually have an inquisition, didn't it? And it did actually, under the order of the Pope, because of Malleus Maleficarum in 1404, it did encourage the Inquisition to search for heretics and witches.
Yeah, and then what happens with the Protestants then? How come they take this on board?
Protestantism believes in the power of the devil just as much. And if you look at the Protestant propaganda, the Pope is always shown as the devil, isn't he? So the whole of the Catholic Church is actually a form of devil worship and bewitchment. So they believe very strongly in witchcraft as well.
As well. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you. We've also got a question from Angela. Angela, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes. Hello, Robert. Hi. I have 2 questions. One sort of banal, but the goat featured as the devil. Why is that?
Goats, most animals have this unfortunate bad reputation, don't they? And goats have the reputation of being dirty and smelly, which obviously they're not. They're also horny. They have
Like
horns,
satires. Oh,
and they're the imagery of the satyr. And the image of the satyr is actually the beginning of the imagery of Christian versions of the devil. And therefore, there's a strong link between particularly wild sexual animals and the devil himself. And the goat was a symbol generally in emblems and so on of lust. And therefore, it seemed the devil would take on the form of a goat because it most suited, as they said, his evil character.
And the second question was, you mentioned how Goya went out of favor towards the end of his career. And why was that?
Because of the way in which actually the court had changed. He had begun as a court artist, producing Rococo pictures. Then in the time of the French invasions, he had got linked very much to the resistance, the guerrillas who were fighting against the Napoleonic invasion and were against, therefore, the monarchy of, do you remember Napoleon puts his brother in charge as king? And therefore, he is not getting court patronage. He's an old man. His style is no longer the fashionable style necessarily. He may well have had not only economic problems, but also problems in relation to mental illness. And therefore, I would say that those dark paintings at the end of his life are where he actually uses the sinister things that happen in witchcraft Sabbaths as symbols of nightmares and worries that he himself was having.
And what's a Sabbath?
The Sabbath is the name for the meeting. The Malleus Maleficarum claim that there were groups of witches, covens, and they then organized themselves into meetings called Sabbats, which is a parody of the word Sabbath. And these Sabbats
the
are
Jewish
not God. Yes, well, the Christian as well. But they're not worshipping God as on a true Sabbath. Sabbat is actually going to be the opposite, where they claim that witches worship the devil.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robert. The last hour has just been magical, if you'll pardon the pun. If, like me, you can't wait for more, please do follow the link to our forthcoming events page in the chat facility now. This time next week, Robert will discuss occult visions from the time of Blake through to modernist artists like Mondrian in the third lunchtime lecture on magical art. On Wednesday evening, we are looking forward to an evening with Hollywood star, actor Jason Isaacs, who promises to spill the beans on a life spent inside other people's heads. I've also included a link to the donations page and a link to the video library, where you can find recordings from all our virtually speaking series of talks so far to enjoy at your leisure. That brings us to the end of today's lecture. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Robert, for once again sharing your incredible knowledge. I hope we see you all again next week, the third in Robert's series on magical art. Enjoy the rest of your day.